I hope your week has gone well. After 2 sessions on reparation justice, we dealt with the issue of children who are perpetrators of sexual violence, the mechanisms and the prevention that is possible, and the accompaniment of these perpetrator children. We asked the Resource Center, CRIAVS from the group of France, Resource Center and place of support and recourse for professionals. So we have 2 speakers, a doctor psychiatrist who also works as a doctor coordinator and consulting and evaluation the care and for paraphilic issues. And we welcome also Sébastien Brochot, who is formator in CRIAVS in France. And he's an author and formator, and he developed an international program for the prevention called the PIDE-ELV and a platform called the Information Sexual Violence. So thank you both, Dr. Albardier and Mr. Brochot, for participating to this webinar, and I give you the floor. And thanks again for speaking slowly to make interpretation easier. Good morning. So CRIAVS Ile-de-France was created in 2008. It is attached to a hospital, so it is a public service, and it is financed by the Regional Agency for Health, the Health Agency, the Health Ministry, the French Health Department. Our mission is to improve the prevention, the understanding, and the care of sexual violence based on an ethical reflection. So Marie-Laure already introduced us. So Dr. Albardier is here. Walter, if you can just show yourself. Good morning, everybody. We're going to be speaking about prevention and accompaniment of adolescents who are perpetrators of sexual violence. But firstly, I'd like to define what we understand by sexual violence. Sexual violence covers acts that go from verbal bullying to forced penetration, as well as other forms of constraint that goes from pressure to social intimidation, all the way to physical force. The World Health Organization has a definition of sexual violence who says any sexual act or any attempt to obtain a sexual act. It could be a comment or some intensive seduction or traffic, or something that is addressed to the sexuality of a person, coercion, and we'll come back to this word, coercion. Therefore, when this act is committed by a person regardless of the relationship,
y compris, bien évidemment, le foyer.
In any context, including at the home or at work. So coercion can include the recourse to force at different degrees, but also psychological intimidation,
ou des menaces.
Also
ça peut être des blessures corporelles, mais ça peut également être par exemple,
corporal wounds, but also threats as far as not giving a job or not having a good grade on an exam. So now that we have defined the sexual violence, I'd like to begin with a first part on the physical place, that is the state of what we do in case of a sexual violence. First of all, there are it's very difficult to have a perfectly fair vision of the broadness of the sexual violence. Why? Because first of all, it depends on based on the difficulty in victims to realize that they were victims. The difficulty victims had to go and make a report to speak about what they experienced. the difficulty in diffusing some facts that happen within certain families with with the forbiddance from other parts of the family to let these facts get out, and also the difficulty that authority have in investigating. In case of a sexual violence, there's a seldom material evidence. It is also due to the fact that these relate to the memory of the victims, but also the memory of the perpetrators and witnesses. The imagination evolves in time. There are facts that pertain to representations. When we speak of sexual violence, for instance, I speak of rape, and many people will imagine an act that is extremely aggressive, violent in the gestures and words and the facts. Sexual violence is rarely aggressive and violent in the act. So many people do not identify in these terms of violence. Therefore, when there are investigations, they will necessarily not feel concerned by this issue. There are also some biases with regard to the type of people, stereotypes. That is, few men who are victims will consider themselves as victims, and few people who were victims of women will manifest themselves. Meanwhile, we do have some knowledge and some estimates about sexual violence. Today, we think that sexual violence affect all populations in the world. They are certainly present in every country, in all cultures, and all social classes. These are poor families or also rich families. The first victims of sexual violence are minors. That is less than 18 years of age. So at the same time, the children, but also adolescents. Before puberty, we think nowadays that girls and boys are undoubtedly victims of sexual violence in the same proportions. But the rapes suffered by boys are less often reported. We think that the majority of the sexual violence happens within the home of the child nowadays. So it is at home that the child is most often victimized. And the same applies to the adolescent. So the perpetrator is almost always a person who's nearby, often a family member of the victim. And when dealing with an adolescent, it is often a person who's nearby. It could be a relative, a parent, a friend. But sexual violence is most often a family trait when affecting minors. Now, with regard to women, this is a taboo issue. It is not discussed too much, but our estimate nowadays is that 1 out of 5 times when a child before puberty is a victim of a sexual violence, 1 out of 5 times it is a woman who has attacked him, an adult woman or an adolescent. It is much difficult for a child victim of a woman to speak, but even to be believed. When he actually speaks and says what he suffered, he will seldom be believed by law enforcement, but also professionals in justice and in child protection. What we do know is that the disabled children are 4 times more at risk to be victims of sexual violence, whether their disability is mental, physical, or emotional disability. I was talking about the privileged families. It is more difficult to identify children who are victims in wealthier families, with parents who have studied, with degrees and important income, which means that oftentimes children who are victims in unprivileged families are more quickly identified by the child protection authorities. It is important to not over-victimize victims. Oftentimes, we hear that a child who was victimized is in a state of a psychological death and that he will not go forward in his life. A Canadian study of about a year and a half ago shows that 65%, so 2/3 of people who were victims of sexual violence in their childhood respond to the criteria of healthy mental health, so that we can go over these criteria. We do not need to justify sexual violence, but just to say that we can go forward. There's a resilience that is possible. Now, from adolescence on, from puberty on, most of the victims are girls, and adolescent boys can also be victims. Half of the rapes of minors are committed by other minors. 1 out of 2 times when a children of less than 18 years old is a victim of sexual violence, his attacker will be less than 18 years of age. There's a lot of sexual violence among minors, be that a rape or other sexual attacks, including sexual harassment. Now, in the judicial system, we see that there's a peak at the age of 14 on the part of perpetrators, and there's a stabilization around the age of 17. I will now give the floor to Walter Albardier, who's going to speak of the psychological mechanisms at stake.
Oui, à moins qu'il y ait déjà des questions, peut-être on va
Unless there are questions, perhaps we will proceed and we
will
en
particulier
speak about the psychological mechanisms, specifically
les agresseurs
when the perpetrators are minors. So for this, I'll try to review the notion of sexuality, child sexuality. I know that these are words that are difficult to speak of sexuality in children. Sometimes it's complicated, but I'm going to try to explain what psychologists and psychiatrists understand by this, and to come back to 2 points, a notion that is rather common nowadays, that is the problematic sexual behaviors. We will also review the clearly transgressive sexual behaviors.
Alors, peut-être pour commencer par parler de la sexualité chez les enfants.
Perhaps to begin speaking of sexuality in children.
D'abord, il faut entendre que la sexualité adulte.
First of all, we have to understand that adult sexuality is a construction, and it is developed throughout our life. It begins very early, but it's never finished. Our sexuality is never over until we die. Sexuality is something that evolves with life and with the encounters during our life, and it starts since childhood. It's true that when we speak of sexuality in children, we're certainly not speaking of the same thing as sexuality in adults. These are terms that can be shocking when they are associated to children and sexuality, but when we speak of sexuality in children, we do not speak of genitality, the sexual organs, as it is not centered, focused on the organs. It is rather pertaining to other things. First of all, the senses. A child during his evolution, which never stops, is discovering his body, his sensations, senses, and emotions. Ultimately, he will be curious to discover throughout the first years of his life. around his body and his emotions, but also the relationship and the other. And all of this is what builds the other, that is his feelings, emotions, what builds his personal relationship with his own sexuality. The discovery in very young children, there are expressions that are not shocking. There are children who are all naked and show their sex with pride, and they touch themselves, and that doesn't mean that these children are disturbed. It's normal. It's about the discovery of sexuality and all of this. This sensuality, this discovery will lead to permanent explorations. So we know of many psychologists and psychiatrists who describe the stages like Freud. We're not going to go back to this, but it begins by the searching throughout the body. We begin with the mouth, and we feel our corporal feelings. There's the pleasure to swallow, etc. Then there's the touch. Those are very important because they build the sexuality in the adult. So first of all, we have the bodily issues, and then the child, as he grows up, continues exploring his body and being sensitive to his own body, but he will be more sensitive to what is relational to others, specifically the children of his age. We often say that children are angels. So, well, you don't need to have studied to know that not all children are angels. And it is when we are very young that we learn to relate to others, how to confront others, listen to others or not listen to others, listen to one's own will and feelings. All of this molds a relationship with the other that will be necessary in relations and sexuality. This is the learning of relations with others and social rules. When a baby is not born with the social rules that affect his culture, his country, these things are learned often through
quelque chose qui est très en rapport avec le plaisir et avec le déplaisir.
That relates to pleasure and unpleasure and bodily elements. Little by little, the child will turn to learning. We know that from the age of 7, 8 years old, the discovery of senses and the discovery of others are kind of set aside, and the child is increasingly interested in intellectual learning and moves his interest toward the learning, and that turns him into a social being. Adolescence will kind of break this period. It breaks it through many things. First of all, because it is a storm. It's ultimately a hormonal storm. Boys and girls see their bodies being transformed, the body they had learned to know. And then there's a quite violent and quick transformation. Well, we've all been through there, so sometimes it happens very quickly. Bodily transformations can be very disturbing. And it goes beyond the corporal transformation. There are thoughts that are changed. There's a greater independence in the person. There's a thought that is more conceptual. And then the child has a more concrete thinking and independence with personal values, as well as an independence that grows with regard to the notions of the adults, the parents. In addition, there's also a transformation within oneself that happens. There's an interest about sexuality and the genitals, and that can be very disturbing. especially since the codes that were learned, the relations and education was not very reassuring before this. In practice, the adolescent finds himself in a paradox he needs to manage. The paradox is that he has to all of a sudden learn to behave with something that was hidden within him and taboo. In many societies, the sexuality of the parents is isolated. It is not exposed to the children, and it is often at the age of adolescence that the children have to manage this. So they have to manage it as they can, and we'll see that that is often a reason why we find sometimes problematic sexual behaviors.
Bien sûr que l'importance
de the dans une nouvelle for these children to situate themselves as far as identity. This is going to happen based on their own experience, but also the social, family, and cultural information. And all of this will make room to perhaps mistakes in the behaviors. So what we nowadays call problematic sexual behaviors, what are they? Of course, as I was saying, since they are very young, there can be in the children's behaviors some expressions, manifestations of sexuality, interest in the genitals, etc. And this becomes problematic, especially when these concerns go beyond the classical, the traditional concerns. Sometimes we identify this in some inhibitions or in insistent behaviors. For example, kids who show themselves completely naked in places where it is not appropriate, or when we try to set them straight, they start all over again, or children who speak a lot about sexuality repeatedly. We can identify in these behaviors children with knowledge concerning sexuality that is much beyond their age. Sometimes if you find a child who's 10 years old who speaks of sexual positions or fellatio or sexual satisfaction, things that are a little out of place. We also find sexual behavior in games that they perform. Sometimes it's okay, it's normal to play wherever we are, but it's okay if two kids play doctor and they discover their bodies, but if their games are done with no coercion, if with no fear, and if they're done in an adjusted manner. There are kids, for example, who have sexual behaviors with animals, and that is atypical, or behaviors of great seduction with adults who behave in a manner that is not appropriate to their age with adults, things that almost become sexual invitations. There are children who show no shame when we speak of sexuality, children who are not limited by the presence of an adult and who continue having attitudes who are inappropriate despite the fact that we try to frame them. These are what we call some problematic behaviors that can indicate a slight disorder, a lack of organization in their sexuality. Of course, sometimes this can be a source and cause for inappropriate behaviors. So these problematic sexual behaviors, of course, have different etiologies and causes. Sometimes, and it's rare, they are they come from a great psychological disorganization, a child who's very unorganized, who has no notions, and who overlaps in all sorts of behaviors. He may present these problematic sexual behaviors. Also, in many cases, what we see in children with inappropriate sexual behaviors is that we have to be watchful to look for sexual abuse they may have experienced. When I speak of sexual abuse, I'm not necessarily speaking of sexual aggression, but it could be the case. They may have suffered sexual acts in their surrounding by the family, etc. And often it is an early exposure to the sexuality of adults. When I'm talking about early exposure, it could be through sexual invitations or a precocious sexual initiation, or also sexual confrontation, sexual in our countries. For example, we see pornography very early on.
L'âge du premier rapport à la pornographie, donc c'est très tôt.
Years old is perhaps the age of the first relationship to pornography. Some children are still physically, psychologically, and hormonally ready to encounter this, but it could be shocking. It could be a little bit of a trauma, as if there was something that comes to alter your thought. I encounter many people who had to face this sexuality too early on, and it is disturbing. And the last thing is perhaps incestuous family atmospheres. Now, incestual doesn't necessarily mean that these children are necessarily abused or attacked within their families, but they have to face family environments where sexuality is prevailing.
Autour de la question de l'intimité, etc., qui ne sont pas respectées, et où ces enfants se voient finalement
limitations that are not observed, and the
permanente de leur espace personnel, de leur corps, des proches.
With regard.
Donc, juste une seconde, je ferme la porte. Peut-être pour vous parler plus directement des enfants, il y a des mineurs.
Children, the minors,
adolescents
who are perpetrators of sexual violence. As Sébastien said, there's a statistic about the age of 14, and then there's more stability at the age of 17. I'd like to say that, first of all, there's not a standard profile for these children, for these sexual perpetrators, and most of them present no specific difficulty, no specific psychopathology, and their acts in general, in most of the cases, will be either isolated or rarely repeated once they are stopped, as if ultimately it is not to deny the importance of the acts, and especially the consequences that these acts can have on the victims. There may be very offensive acts. However, despite these acts, they could relate to games, exploration, and sexual initiation, or a hazardous learning, but they are not, there's no seriousness, and these children will not be disturbed. It's difficult to hear, but sexuality, in fact, can be learned by trial and error. Sometimes errors are tragic. These are the stigmas, the signs of a difficult entry to adult sexuality for kids who have bad points of reference and who live this psychological and bodily storm that is adolescence. Now, in addition to, next to this, for a large proportion of adolescents, we encounter adolescents who experienced major child traumas. So in the general population will find children victimized during their early on, whether these victimizations are psychological, sexual, physical, or exposure to parental violence, and sometimes also due to neglect or great affective deficiency. This can also apply to children for whom the family model is one of violence. There are families where ultimately it is the place of violence is taken for granted. So we often see a confrontation with the exposure to adult sexuality in one of the parents or older brothers and sisters, be that through pornography or inappropriate solicitations. These experiences have a negative effect on the psychological evolution, and oftentimes we notice difficulties in self-regulating emotions, difficulties in controlling aggressiveness. People are both excited and there's a neuroticism in this aggressiveness, and there's an aggressiveness that is eroticized. Often these are children who are anxious, who have low self-esteem, attachment troubles, and relational difficulty. These are rarely children who are socially comfortable, who are dominating. They often they're often taken out on younger children that may be like little children in their neighborhood or cousin, because they have difficulties in establishing relationships among them or with their parents. They often live in an atmosphere that is not secure. And the representation of another person makes it complicated to establish a normal, effective relationship based on consent and a mutual relationship with people their age. These relations are often built without the child being under the impression of being aggressive or an attacker, without the child realizing that he is older. He often considers the age difference with his victim as a strategy, because he takes shelter in a reassuring relationship that he will develop. In most of the cases, the transgressive acts are performed by these young people in the hope of having a mutual participation in this relationship, even if the victim is 4 or 5 years old and the perpetrator 14, 15. There's like a feeling of being a child to child when there's actually a great age difference. There is a major third group of adolescent perpetrators for whom the aggressive trait is predominant, because I like to distinguish what has to do with inappropriate sexuality and erotic sexual violence and the violence through sex. In this last category, sexual attacks are more attacks rather than inappropriate sexuality. In these children, what is paramount, the first issue is first to attack, to submit, and show power over someone else. These adolescents, these transgressive adolescents, are distinguished by the others from adult attackers. They're distinguished by minor sexual interest. These are people who imagine violent scenarios, but it begins to be built. So it is. These are often the resurgence of souvenirs of recollection of scenes that they were exposed to, and the need to regain control will lead them to sometimes relive some situations they already experienced that are traumatic, to actually experience the situation in real life by taking the reins of the situation. In these cases, a sexual attack is, we are less in the idea of sharing with a small child. Violence is unleashed here, and the ways of constraint to go beyond the simple seduction, suggestion, or strong invitation. We actually fall in the use of physical violence, threats, psychological violence, in order to reach his goals. These usually come from very dysfunctional families where sexuality can appear as a tool for dominating or power. The young patient that I attended, that I helped for a long time, used to speak of his father. His father was very proud of the fact that his child could ultimately express his sexuality, because in his home, men had to be young, had to be real men. And the fact of raping a 13-year-old girl, there was a major problem because he had not violated her a bit, but all the way. But in general terms, in adolescence, these sexual perpetrators show less traits of as psychopath. They are less impulsive than other types of minor delinquents, of minor criminals. They are less led to use drugs or alcohol than the other non-sexual adolescent criminals. In these groups, it is essentially about, as Sébastien was saying, it is essentially mostly boys. Sometimes girls can also act in groups. Sometimes we encounter them in some social homes in France. The aggressive dimension is often as significant. These are children who often, I will say, in all three categories, but it is more applicable to this one, they often present failing social skills. They are not socially skilled, and anxiety that is more important than other types of crimes for their age. For some of them, they have some narcissistic traits. They interpret frustrations as something that is unbearable, and it is often a refusal of their sexual invitations that will lead them to frustration. It will lead to a sort of narcissistic rage with a strong factor of destruction, of a desire for destruction. And there's a need for restoration of this psychological fragile moment. It's a moment of great psychological fragility. Sexuality in this case is rather working in self-destruction instead of pleasure. We are talking about enjoyment and destruction. Well, I'm not finished with this point, but we are rarely dealing with children who are sexually attracted by violent situations. For some, this begins to emerge, and most of the adult sexual perpetrators have begun having a deviated sexuality when they were minors, and most of the minors who have deviated sexuality do not grow as such. So we have to make a distinction. So the majority, because I know this was a question, most of the pedophiles are people who are adults and sexually attracted to children. Most of these people started feeling their first interest for children when they were minors. But when you're small, when you're a child, when you have inappropriate sexual behaviors, they do not necessarily stay in adult age.
Bien, merci pour la présentation.
Thank you.
Je suis Rose du Burkina Faso. Ma question est la suivante. Quel pourrait être le rôle exact des parents face à ce fléau? Parce qu'il y a des parents qui encouragent les enfants à la prostitution, juste pour des raisons de pauvreté, des situations familiales. Il y a aussi des parents qui restent passifs parce qu'il y a des enfants qui s'habillent, sont tellement mal habillés et l'habillement attire les garçons, il provoque. Et les parents ne disent rien. Quel peut être réellement le rôle des parents face à cette situation?
What could be the role of parents in this situation? I will begin with the first question about the statistics. I will send you a link. It's a page in French. The source of these statistics are international, but they especially rely on studies done in Western countries. Some studies come from France, many come from Canada, as they finance many studies. Some come from the United States, and other studies come from European countries, all sorts of European countries, including Eastern countries. But it's true that most of the studies come from Western countries that give financing. So with regard to these questions, I just want to say that after the break, we're going to speak of prevention of sexual violence and also care for the minor perpetrators. So for the time being, we can continue with questions on statistics and psychological mechanisms.
Alors, oui, deux choses. Les statistiques, elles sont effectivement...
Two things. Statistics are in fact mostly Western American and European, but there are studies done by the WHO with the similar proportions as to numbers. We know that some cultural elements can change the issue of sexual violence. There's more sexual violence in countries where the stereotypes referred to social places, the social places of men and women create a significant gap. The more we validate the issue of sexual violence by holding a woman in a space and a man in another place, the more there can be significant numbers of sexual violence. So there are cultural elements also that come to play. And the parents are the first bearers of the cultural and social values. If the education of a child indicates that it's okay to show his sex and to jump on his cousin, and if it's acceptable to have an inappropriate behavior, and that he can do whatever he pleases with girls. Of course, he will be the bearer as a possible perpetrator. And the last point about the clothing. There's an exhibition that went around, I think, the United States and then France, who was quite interesting. It was an exhibition that showed the clothing worn by adult women at the time when they had been raped. And in fact, they were not sexy at all. Most of them were not dressed in a provoking manner. These are representations that can be exterior. A man who rapes a woman does not rape her because of how she's dressed. It can often lead to some macho expressions, etc. But this is not what creates, opens the passage to an act. And among adults and adolescents, their purposes are very clear about the place of the woman, and they have a representation of the woman as something that is inaccessible, and this representation leads them more to a rape rather than the easy woman. Okay, thank you for this clarification. There are two questions in Spanish and one in my question is to consider that an adolescent that exercises a sexual violence against a boy or a girl or a peer, we also must consider that he is a victim, or he was the victim of sexual violence, perhaps in his family environment.
Necesariamente tener como esa mirada,
immediate environment. We need to have an experience in a community space and see whether that happened. That 12-year-old child exerts sexual violence against a 5-year-old. So in Paraguay, in my country, justice does not keep in mind
no tiene en cuenta todo eso, ese contexto detrás.
In mind the context that is beneath this.
Quedó cancelada. Esa es
so the measure was canceled. So that's the experience I wanted to share, and I wanted to ask about this. My question is with regard to, are there any studies that can point out whether the policies for sexual and reproductive health positively affected the formation processes in childhood? It is very important because this is a reality of public health and human rights. In my country, sexual violence against childhood is a problem of public health, and there's a policy of sexual and reproductive health, and despite all the taboos and the myths with regard to sexuality, apparently the theme is not addressed, so there's a disorientation. So I wanted to ask whether there are experiences where there are specific processes of comprehensive formation to address sexuality since early childhood, involving also parents, because that's another important element that needs to be addressed when dealing with the culture and the respect for the body, the life of childhood, and sexuality by stages. Perhaps I'm going to answer Doris's question.
Le monde n'est pas fait d'auteurs et de victimes.
Well, the world is not made of perpetrators and victims. It's not divided into two, especially when it comes to children. I mostly deal with adult perpetrators, but also child perpetrators. but I have many people who were victims in adult age. So the explanation is not an excuse, but of course, a child with inappropriate behavior has to be addressed. We have to try to understand why the behavior is inappropriate. Even he's still a child. To me, he's still a child. And in France, it's true that we have a culture of justice when it comes to children that relies a lot on protection since 1945. We consider that a child is not an adult, a small adult. He's actually a little less responsible for his acts because he's a child. Because I am a doctor, I deem that even in adult age, some people have some traumas, and when this happens, we have to also address those. For me, a child with inappropriate sexual behaviors, we need to investigate why this happens. It is rarely because the devil has taken over him. I mean, it's often because, I don't mean to sound provoking, but it's often because he's come across some relational aberrations or educational aberrations, and this needs to be fixed and repaired. He's still a victim, and perhaps there's some reparation that is required, but we still have to care for this perpetrator and not click him as a bad subject. Otherwise, this is going to continue. Does this respond to Angelica? Sébastien will respond to Angelica. Okay, I'm going to speak about prevention later and give more details, but yes, there are some studies nowadays that show positive results in the policies that were adopted. And nowadays, certain approaches are more effective than others and have a real impact. In fact, when they take into account all the members of the environment of the child, the educational teams and parents, these interventions have a greater impact. In Quebec, for example, they saw that sexual education allowed for a drastic reduction in violence among minors. Following some elections, they stopped these school interventions, and in a few years, they increased again. And they have once again reinstated these interventions. And for the past 3 years, they've seen a decrease again. In the Italian-speaking Switzerland, I know that they have established from a government level, they have established actions that are done first by stages, first in schools, then with parents, and then with children. In the Netherlands, they have integrated to the school curriculum some interventions on effective education. In Spain, they have resumed they have taken the Quebec program from the 80s, they have translated it, and they offer it to the children. And it's called Sentir que sí, Sentir que no. There are very many programs in existence. The Columbia University in New York in 2018 performed a study to see what the impact of all these interventions was at the time they are at the university level. They showed very clearly that these interventions, these interior interventions allowed to limit the sexual violence suffered during the university years. And they also showed that the education that promotes sexual abstinence had no positive impact. So we have these results from these studies.
Merci.
Thank you. Short questions.
Merci Marie-Laure. Nous remercions Walter et Sébastien pour les brillants exposés.
For the presentation.
J'ai deux petites questions. Je vais commencer.
I have a few questions. I have a couple of questions. I will start with some children identified by our organization. These are children who were taken out of armed forces, specifically girls who had perhaps aggressive behaviors, and even educators had some advances from these girls. Is this a reproduction of what they experienced during the rebellion and everything that we experienced in my country, because it was difficult to manage sexual issues with educators? The second question is, you said that rarely do we have material evidence when it comes to sexual attacks in our country. In DRC, Congo, Kinshasa, there's a phenomenon we called the sexually transmitted points at the university level. But is there not a study to push politicians to take concrete actions in this regard? But at least the girls do not report. So what could happen to these girls once they are married, if from a behavioral standpoint? These are my questions. Thank you.
Bon, je suis pas spécialiste des enfants soldats.
I'm not a specialist of child soldiers. I've come across a few in France, but what is often very evident in young people who found themselves in situations of war and conflict or a child soldier, it is that often they represent what they think the adult position is rather than actually living it. These young girls ultimately know that they have a role, some sort of characteristic and attribution with when it comes to sexuality. I don't know what there is, but the issue of this freedom, the sexuality of the body, etc. Perhaps these are events they experienced or traumas due to the war, etc. And we know that rape is one of the first hazards during war, but perhaps it's also ultimately that these young girls are to act as adults, assume behaviors that they think pertain to an adult person. Perhaps we can make a distinction. We can make a distinction in what we find in these ill-structured children. Perhaps we can find an education where personal values are not developed and they come to grasp the representations, the gross representations of the place where they should be. Ultimately, sometimes we find young girls who, far from their own will or from their bodily experience, will have some inappropriate sexual behaviors, and they will hurt themselves and get into prostitution. These are people who confront their bodies to some representations they have of what sexuality could be, but very far from sexuality that is associated with pleasure, and that we can hope for the ones and the others. As to the second part of the question, I completely forgot what you were referring to. So if you can please remind me.
La deuxième partie, c'était sur la difficulté.
Let Sébastien answer. As far as the second part, it was about the difficulty in material evidence. As a matter of fact, it is very complicated. I forgot because I was reading the other question that was just sent that refers to something quite similar. But it refers to the difficulty of actually identifying sexual violence. when the children are very disturbed sexually and when they perhaps were used as sexual objects, obviously they have a certain distance with their body. They cannot completely inhabit it at all times when it comes to physical contact. This is something that can raise problems and that needs to be worked out with psychologists. I'm thinking of a study that had been performed precisely in Congo by some Belgians, which was very interesting, dealing with the impact of rape on very small girls and the reconstruction. I remember the conclusion of the study, which was that when the environment, the social environment, the family and the whole village worked at these issues and accompanied and helped the children, they managed better to move forward and to be structured. So it is truly a community and social problem. I kind of distance myself from material evidence with regard to sexual violence among children. In fact, this goes back to the stereotypes. That is, that instinctively we're going to consider boys as attackers and the girls as victims. So after the break, we will talk about prevention. And we know that this is helpful. Sometimes it is the reality. Boys are going to reenact something that they think is their role. Therefore, they're going to place themselves in a position of superiority as compared to girls. But sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes it is the girls who are going to play and go search for the little boys. And the adult instinct is to right away see the girl as a victim and the boys as the perpetrator. These are things that we have to work at as adults. So we have to speak to help boys manage to say that they were victims and help girls to be able to say that at some point they can actually be in a position of coercion and be violent. We speak a lot today of equality between men and women. My conviction is that we can achieve better equality once we recognize the vulnerability of boys and men and the potential of violence in girls and women, reducing the occurrence of sexual violence. So for instance, as I was talking, these are campaigns, awareness campaigns, projects for effective education. Secondary prevention aims at identifying sexual violence or problematic behaviors that may be at the origin of sexual violence. These are formations, for instance, about the signs that allow to identify the victims. Tertiary prevention aims at taking care of sexual violence victims and perpetrators, and also the other people, that is, the people near the victims, near the perpetrators, but also the professionals that care for victims and perpetrators. These are prevention programs for resilience. So the prevention of sexual violence covers these three types of prevention. So the objective is to improve as much as possible the primary prevention in order to avoid the occurrence of sexual violence. And the more we strengthen primary prevention, the less we'll have to carry out actions of secondary and tertiary prevention. In other words, identifying victims is very important, but intervening so as there are no victims is even better. So, what approaches? There are several approaches for prevention, including in the area of sexual violence. We can distinguish prevention based on the population. This is the approach of Robert Gordon, who established in 1982 a theory of prevention with three approaches. The approach of universal prevention directed to the population as a whole, whatever their health is, with the objective of establishing a favorable cultural environment to allow each to maintain, preserve, or improve health, and that is what we usually call education for health. There's a second approach that is selective prevention oriented to the subjects at risk in the objective to try to prevent the issue. So in this case, sexual violence. So these people may be at risk because there are some family factors or environmental factors. To take a concrete example, in the area of sexual violence, for instance, a person who's already suffered sexual violence is more at risk of being a victim again or of becoming a perpetrator. A person who is going to feel sexual attraction for children will potentially be more at risk than another person of attacking a child. And a third approach is prevention targeted prevention for people who are ill to better manage their treatment. A person with a pre-existing condition receive a therapeutic education, and this addresses people who present individual risk factors or who manifest initial symptoms in the area of sexual violence. This would be a perpetrator of sexual violence that we would put under hormonal treatment to allow an availability that is necessary for a therapeutic project. Prevention can also address the causes to diminish the effects. Addressing the causes implies to identify them, obviously. So in the area of sexual violence, I'm going to distinguish the factors that operate at four levels: individual, at the relational level, community level, and the societal level. Let us begin by individual and relational factors. This relies on researches that dealt more with men as perpetrators of sexual violence, because these are the people that we firstly look at when we work with sexual violence. But by extension, we're going to say that an adolescent will be more at risk of acting if he belongs to a gang, if he uses drugs or alcohol or participates to a traffic, if he is exposed to sexual violence in his environment, specifically violence by his parents, if he himself was a victim of sexual or physical violence during his childhood, if he only has one level of instruction, and if he has a strong acceptance of violence, for instance, someone who considers that it is okay to beat the friend, if he multiplies partners in fidelity, or if he has an unequal vision of the genders, and if he has already committed sexual violence or participated to prostitution networks. These are the individual factors. Now, about community and society and the societal factors. they can be of paramount importance to try to prevent sexual violence before it appears. It is often society and culture who perpetrate the beliefs that justify violence, as Walter was saying before. So a man, an adolescent, will be more at risk of passing to action if he lives in an environment where men are considered to be superior to women, where sexual relations are considered as a right, if we consider that the rape is a sign of masculinity, or if sexual violence is not punished or considered as non-problematic. So, the following stage, when we come to prevention, we firstly relied on repression. We thought that having a criminal system that was very repressive would be sufficient to decrease the number of sexual attacks. In the practice, a well-organized criminal system, in fact, allows for a better handling of violence, but that is not sufficient. So in the evolution of the spirit, specifically as of the 80s, we based prevention on intervention with the children, with messages to invite the children to distrust adults who could hurt them. And these actions had an impact, but a limited impact. Firstly, because it generated a lot of anxiety in children, and the anxiety causes insecurity. And then because these actions pointed the finger at potential attackers outside of the family. But as I said before, the perpetrators of sexual violence are first and foremost members of the family, people who are nearby. So today we have an approach that is slightly different. Today, the approach we have to prevent sexual violence is more based on public health, with a message indicating that violence is not the result of a single risk factor, rather the product of several factors that interact at the individual, relational, but also community and social level. So the actions that we carry out in very different areas, such as health, education, social work, and criminal justice, all of this, as we improve services and the support that is offered to people who face sexual violence, all this allows to better prevent sexual violence. I'm going to say it more quickly. We find the best prevention results when the approach is holistic, transversal, and global. So prevention actions that are carried out nowadays throughout the world and that for several decades allowed us to take a step back and know what works better and what works less, although there are still difficulties in the evaluation. The primary prevention actions that are targeted are effective when they address all the members within a group. If I take the example of adolescents, 15-year adolescents, if you intervene with 15-year-old girls but not the boys, there's a risk that the action will be less effective than if from the beginning you integrate all the 15-year-old adolescents. If you integrate all the adolescents, in addition to their parents and their teachers, then you will still increase the chances for your action to be effective, and that the results of this action will last in time. Among the actions that seem to be the most effective today to prevent sexual violence, there are actions addressing the future parents or young parents. For instance, programs for prenatal or postnatal life in home that will reduce the risks of neglect and physical and psychological abuse of children. In other words, by accompanying couples to welcome a child or their child, by being by their side to support them, to respond to their questions, and to reframe wherever there's no point of reference, we limit the violence. For instance, that is the support that is given to parents who have addictions, such as alcoholism, by offering solutions to manage their addiction. So among the promising initiatives, we find some strategies for community mobilization to make norms and behaviors evolve when community efforts to improve representations and the social and economic status of the women in order to establish a balance. We identified that the health establishment are interesting points of entry to prevent this violence because we are close to the public, of course. So the prevention actions can address individuals of all ages, early childhood, and elderly people. But of course, we will always make adjustments in our message for the age from a development and understanding level. With children, prevention consists in helping these children to acquire psychosocial skills, because psychosocial skills will help children in all areas of life, in school, at home, with friends, during activities outside of school, etc. Very quickly, what are psychosocial skills? It is a group of capabilities that allow a person to manage his everyday life and relations with others by being fulfilled, adopting an appropriate behavior in a given environment. So there are five pairs of skills. I'm not going to look into all of them, but basically it deals with capable of problem solving, communicating effectively, to feel empathy for others, to know how to manage emotions. So the learning of these skills can deal with actions or supports for awareness. It could be games, books, posters, sounds, videos, some theater, internet websites. You can imagine anything. So I'm going to offer some examples of prevention actions. The first example is an action for education for empathy. It is a project with 13-year-olds. An animator gives a subject. I'll give you an example. The use of the mobile phone when we are in school during class. An animator provides this subject and he invites participants, therefore the 13-year-olds, to put themselves on one side or the other of a line that is traced on the floor. If they are in favor of the use of telephone, they will place themselves on one side of the line on the floor. If they are against, they will place themselves on the other side of this line. So we have adolescents on each side of the line And those who do not know exactly whether they're in favor or against, they stay at the center. And then the animator asks both groups to prepare an argument to defend their viewpoint. So obviously, if all adolescents are on one side of the line, if they're in favor or against, the animator can place himself on the other side to offer a different viewpoint to participants. Once the one who's going to present the argument starts to work, the adolescents are entitled to changing sides. And it can also be interesting to approach the line or distance yourself from the line. I am very much in favor or not in favor at all. So you can either be closer or farther from the line. The objective is to open critical windows, to invite them to put themselves in the other's shoes so that the other seems closer. This is a learning of otherness. Another much simpler game that is inspired by the questionnaire of Proust. These are questions that invite the person to an introspection. What is my main defect? What is my definition of happiness? What are the defects that seem more urgent? This questionnaire can be adjusted to all ages, even as of the age of 3 or 4, with simpler question. What animal would you like to be? What is your favorite flower? Another game is a game about empathy. At the beginning, it's a card game, and at the beginning of the game, you are given a character. You choose a card, and you'll be a young 17-year-old homosexual, or you'll be a 20-year-old woman, and you are raising your child alone. Once you have this character, you'll be asked questions, and you have to answer these questions by placing yourself in the place of your character. An example, as far as question is, can I walk alone on the street at night? Can I easily rent or buy an apartment wherever I live? Can I easily register to university? So this game allows to become aware of the difficulties that certain members of society can face, including the people of the other sex. And this is a work that deals with otherness and empathy. I also wanted to show you an example of what we created. This is a preventive support that dates back to 2018. And at the time of the Me Too wave, we wanted to create some material to aid the 15 to 25-year-old young people to better understand what consent to a sexual act means. So we created an internet site, consentment.info, and we produced some videos to respond to questions raised by young people. An example of question is, if I did not say no, is it rape? If I did not verbalize the actual word no, can it still be considered as rape? Another question is, as of what age can I consent to a sexual relation? Another example is, how can I say stop to my partner if I do not want to go any farther? So we created these videos, and we needed to give visibility to this website. So we wrote a song, and we produced a video. We chose a humoristic approach that even looks like a caricature. It is kind of touching on this audiovisual atmosphere, and we spread this song on social networks, and it was very successful. In a few weeks, it was seen more than 4 million times within a week. So I suggest to look at an excerpt. See if you can hear it.
voilà. Vous voyez que la prévention des violences sexuelles,
prevention of sexual violence doesn't necessarily go through grave and serious or sad messages. You can have a positive discourse, an optimistic discourse about sexuality by informing adolescents of the legal limitations and the limitations that are imposed not only by law, but the life together. You're going to find in French, sorry for the other languages, on the website violencessexuelles.info, you will find information and supports for prevention. There are some materials that exist in 3 languages on this website. I can give you the information about this. Do we pass to Walter right away?
Oui, moi je vais vous parler de prise en charge
I'm going to speak about support for perpetrator of sexual violence who are minors. The support in an ideal world is just catching up with a psychological evolution, a personal evolution that led a young person to not know how to behave, to not know how to manage himself or situate himself in a relationship with the other, because ultimately in most of the cases that is what happens. Of course, it is not a support that is only psychological, psychiatric. It'd be too simple, and it's a temptation sometimes in Western countries to think that perpetrators of sexual violence are ill and that they just need medications. It's more complicated than you may have understood. And the support is the interface of many fields. I'm going to speak from my perspective.
Je vais vous parler essentiellement.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about psychiatric support, family support, but of course, the support in a society must also include judicial and penitential. And Sébastien was saying that, yes, a justice that is structured also helps to decrease, to reduce the occurrence of sexual violence, because it is a societal support. But in the great majority of minors who are arrested, the arrest in itself stopped inappropriate behaviors is already the best way of stopping somebody who's behaving inappropriately. It's the best way we have found, so that the person can realize that his behavior is inappropriate. Contrarily to what we think, the great majority of sexual perpetrators do not relapse, do not restart. And very often, the people who commit sexual acts, even minors, I don't have many who are proud of what they've done. When they are confronted with this, and when we refer them to the otherness, when we tell them to put themselves in the place of their victim, that is sufficient to understand that they are not to go proud of what they did. So anyhow, the support I'm going to address is psychiatric, traumatological, and addictive, because in fact, a great deal of people or children we meet are very much affected by life, devastated by life. There's no specific model. There's not a single way of dealing with the issue, although sometimes we wanted to rationalize this in certain Western countries over the last few years, but there's not a single possibilities or one way of doing things. What we especially need are things that are adjusted to the difficulties of each person and their needs. I encountered children, patients who are very disturbed, psychiatric, and from a psychiatric standpoint. Now, the causes are another issue, but we know that sometimes these are individual issues, so sometimes they're genetic, or sometimes because of their life environment. But the priority is to support the psychiatric disorders when they exist. If we have a child who's very disturbed or troubled, with great difficulties with relationships of other, when he constantly feels constantly persecuted, when he's very depressed, we must support this, and it is the first thing to address. If I speak of traumatology, dealing, the most representative element is that we have to see whether children have post-traumatic troubles, for example, in children who ultimately are constantly alert, who re-experience scenes that they had to face when they had to face death. And we talked about child soldiers. Oftentimes we have children who are who have a very distant relationship with their body. They live their body as if it were not really their own, with difficulties of anxiety and hyperactivity,
des cauchemars,
nightmares, hypervigilance, etc. And this too has to be considered, just as the personality disorders or symptoms who are very frequent. I was recalling that the great majority of these children, although they may have very violent presentations, they are often anxious children who have no tools to be able to encounter the others and who are lacking social skills. And because of these this lack, they may take specific positions to try to experience some situations in a very secure manner. Oftentimes in children and in early childhood, the addictions also have to be considered. There are often addictions in very young children that hide the traumas and the lacks of education. Products such as cannabis, etc., are to be considered, and we increasingly deal with addiction to internet addiction of children who completely lose their relational skills with others and who have tantrums when you take them away from their screen. And this is a demonstration of a great difficulty to just be. There's another point that I think needs to be explored in adolescence. It is the sexological area, because there are children. Well, first of all, it's interesting to see what their representation of sexuality is, and there are often great distortions from a cognitive standpoint, some representations about sexuality that are inappropriate. There are often children who think they are very late in sexuality. In Western countries, this happens. The average age for a first sexual relations is around 17 years old. These children who are going to commit reprehensible sexual acts often think that they are late when they are 14. They often have the representation of a role that needs to be taken, and they consider to play a role in sexuality. They address their needs. We investigate how they learned about sexuality and their sexual relation, and this is interesting to disorganize and rework the representations that are perhaps inappropriate. When I speak of this, I talk of the influence that pornography can have, the influence on the more fragile children, of the representations which may be shared with some parents, or representations that are built in families about sexuality. What is also interesting is to present what these children think about what the sexual act is. And sometimes we are very surprised as we confront their representation of what the body is, what is the masculine body, the feminine body. Sometimes we are very surprised by children who have no anatomical notion at all of their sexuality. All these elements in psychiatric care are the initial way to support, to take care of a person. It is the first look before we enter more into psychology and start working with emotional dimensions, feelings, thoughts, the assertiveness, the capability to affirm oneself and to confront our own desires. Sébastien was saying that when it comes to education for sexuality and affectivity in children, this is something that is usually done quite naturally, quite harmoniously for most of us. But for these children, we have to rework this, because often there are deficiencies. I have children who have great difficulties in telling me why they love their girlfriend. Sometimes it's because they are trying to just be trendy, but sometimes it's because they really have trouble. So this is not a lot to define the other. Sometimes they say because she's clean, or others they will say that they do not represent the canons that we have based on pornography. Well, this is to be reworked in a more psychological perspective. As Sébastien was saying, a major issue is the access to otherness, a relationship with the other, perhaps with a beginning of empathy. This is very complicated because it means that in order to know what the other thinks and to step into the other's shoes, well, it's not that. Empathy for me is to imagine what the other thinks and to have an action in his regard that does not relate to how I think the other is feeling. So for this, we have to first of all have a representation of ourselves. Then you have to have the capability to identify one's own feelings, to distinguish them from each other, to name them. Imagine that the other is capable of representing all of this. All of this is a great journey. Sometimes the easy is not complicated, and there's a very practical tool, which is the group. Sometimes it's not about joining attackers or sexual perpetrators. This is a very practical tool in the therapeutical groups, as in groups for sex education. What we learn is not just sexuality, it's the other. And the other will come and push you around, the other that I identify with. And for some of our children, the issue is that they identify too much and they stick to the other, and they cannot set a distance. And to work on my similarity to the other, my distinction is interesting. And in a group, whatever the medium is, it could be through words, it could be groups where we speak, groups when we build together. It's also about maintaining our place, more or less your place, to not be demanding of other, And it's true that the group has a real added value when it comes to caring for these children who are perpetrators, because they learn what the other is. In these groups, I think that one of the great topics is to review go back to the act. It cannot be a naive type of care. The question of going back to the act, to me, is of vital importance. As I said before, we do not have to think that the child is a victim also when he's a perpetrator, but he's also a perpetrator and he's responsible for his actions, and he must also consider that his actions have an impact on his environment. And going back to the act is also important to have him face his responsibility. It is not to make him feel guilty, it's rather to try to reach an understanding and to see how things have evolved. I think that this is necessary. The guilt trip pure is not great. It's not about going back to the facts and saying, do you realize what you did? At the beginning, it's okay, but it is to justify structure and reinforcing a negative representation and the negative feeling of this child. It's not very helpful. It can help to make sense because
was it
because of rage, of anger? Was it inappropriate, and why? These are interesting elements, but without insisting on the part of guilt. And now, to give some room to questions, I think that a major pillar with minors is especially the care, the family care. As Sébastien was saying, most of the perpetrators act in the proximity of the victims, and most of the minors attack children in their family or neighborhood. And it is often in certain families, it is overwhelming when we learn that the older one raped the younger one. Whatever cultural representation may be attached to all of this. If your son rapes your daughter, these are very complicated situations. And to prevent this child or the family to choose among the children, this family needs to be, first of all, accompanied and supported in order to not analyze the acts for both victim and perpetrator, but also to find a balance. It's not about saying, okay, you ask for forgiveness and we go back and we start again, but we have to question this attack and what happened in this family. These families have to be mobilized because sometimes the parents' attitudes are problematic, and if they feel confident, they can also question some family situations which may affect the children, and this can be helpful, and it is important to work at that. As I indicated before, the first providers of value are the parents. Therefore, they must be associated to this, and also to avoid these families to turn to extreme reactions, denial or trivialization, which is not an attitude that can help the child to develop. I want to give you some time for a debate if you so wish. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Brochot, for all these elements with regard to awareness and the support and care with some concrete examples. I think this is very clear because, in fact, there are different aspects. We have to know who we need to address, and it is important for us. We will readdress this during our next sessions. And with regard to care, this resonates with what we worked on for reparative justice during our last two sessions, to understand the causes and consequences for the perpetrator and the victim. So we have a good link, a connection. It's especially about understanding and addressing the responsibility. Now, as far as questions, we have Ine from the DRC who wants to speak, and also Edouard, who's a psychologist. These first two questions. Thank you. I have a question about the level of care, the psychiatric care. There's the traumatology care and also addictology. My question is about the psychiatric level. At which level of sexual abuse can we really establish a connection between psychiatry and the fact of being the victim of a sexual violence or perpetrator? The connection between the symptoms that we can identify to be a victim or perpetrator, if that is also related to psychiatry. It's a complicated question because I think it is about knowing at what place we must place psychiatry. I think it's quite different based on the country where we are. Well, how can I say this? When I speak of psychiatry, I speak of structured mental disease, which are classified in an international recognized classification. What's interesting is that we cannot say that sexual attacks are depending on a mental disease, but it's more complicated because pedophilia today might be a mental disease, etc., but it's a little complicated. Anyhow, if the sexual aggression is not a mental disease, we find an important proportion of mental disease in people who commit these attacks. And first of all, personality disorders, but also real depressions. Sometimes they're structured, sometimes they are old, some post-traumatic troubles, as I said, addictions, depression, schizophrenia, psychotic disorders. There's a number of diseases, but anyhow, I think we have to be very careful in not neglecting this. I usually rely on some scales, some evaluations, and I have a lot of people who present these disorders, a lot of depressed people, and they experience depressions. Sometimes they are infraclinical, but they are often beyond the infraclinical. There are people with anguishes. We have many people with anxiety disorders. And if these people were not sexual perpetrators, we would still have to care for them. And sometimes these illnesses are in connection with the action, because when you are depressed, when you tend to be an alcoholic, your relationship with the other is very disturbed. For some schizophrenic subjects who have a very disorganized behavior, and for victims as well, this goes in both directions. There are people who present some mental disorders who are the first vulnerable people. The disabled people are very vulnerable to attacks by others, and they add suffering to their condition. This adds an illness, this adds anxiety, it adds post-traumatic trauma disorders. So we have to make a distinction between these spaces. I think that the best thing is a classical care. One thing that goes very a person who does well, who is evolving in a healthy environment, who's protected, who's been taught to live, etc. It is rare that we will find them committing facts in which he's going to have an impact on the other to that extent. If you look at the jails in Western countries, there's a overrepresentation of mentally diseased, mentally ill people, because people who are not well just do whatever and behave badly. It sounds kind of silly, but instead of stigmatizing them as evil or the devil, we have to look for humanity as what we're saying about restorative justice. We have to recall that those who commit these acts, although they may be monstrous, are still human beings. They have an itinerary and they have a representation of the other person who are completely altered. Perhaps a question. You speak about a legal process against the child. Do you intervene on a justice decision after a psychiatric expertise? Do the parents come see you? Is it simultaneously with the process, or is it after a process? To also clarify the moment. I don't have much to clarify because I'm going to say all of the above. I work with people who have to come see me because the justice has decided that they have to come see me either before or after a judgment. But I also see people who have not committed anything but who were never caught. I have people who come because they know that they are fragile and they are inappropriate sexual behaviors, also illegal ones. And I see people who continue seeing me even if they're no longer obliged to do so. With regard to minors, sometimes it's because something happened in the family, sometimes because it was dictated by the law, sometimes it's not yet dictated by the law. But the question is that it have to be dictated by the law. It's very complicated in France nowadays. I think it's not the only place, but we have a real problem with justice of minors. It's very delayed. I'm following a boy who committed the sexual violence at the age of 15 years old, and he was judged 2 weeks ago, and he's 22. So the delay for justice to take a position while this child was suspended, was hanging for 7 years. He was suspended and hanging, waiting for a judgment. This is awful. And I think that the issue of justice for minors is an issue. Things have to be dealt with. He evolved because his parents and the people around him have an adjusted behavior. If the environment is supportive, which doesn't mean to affirm and validate his action, but if they take up an appropriate position. So he kind of resolved it, but this is an issue. This is a concern from a justice perspective. Some children are in full construction and they go quickly, and they have to be quickly supported. Bene is back. If there are no further questions, we can probably bring this to an end. Yes, my question was regarding the acceptance of violence. I know that the context changes and it depends from one country to another. But I appreciated the presentation when we spoke of the parents who think that these acts are acceptable. So, and also the economic concern to send a daughter to practice prostitution. There are also situations, especially in family violence, when the children are victims of violence by people nearby, by the relatives, for instance, the father or the uncle. We have the problem of children who also do domestic work, and these situations are kept secret. Even if you want to address them, there will be some repercussions even from the family. So I'd like to know how one can address these issues with more concrete examples that perhaps were successful. And aside from this, there's this duty of when the families are accomplices, how can we help the children and how can the family be involved in the process, because there are cases of silence and it becomes like a family secret to the detriment of the victim. My second concern, and that's also what I appreciated when dealing with the prevention, I was saying we were talking about some examples, but we did not go in depth. In fact, there was a notion of social norms. We can speak of wars. I wanted to mention the deep causes for this violence. What we usually experience with different approaches, different behaviors. Some behaviors represent some violence, and these are accepted as a way of life in a community or another. So what are the effective ways to prevent this? And what about the approach of education to masculinity? And we lost him. He's breaking up. Grounded in the culture, how can we involve them in the transformation of masculinity? Sometimes it works, but there are cases of resistance. I want to speak of the children who came out of armed group who were used in violence and who took this up as their regular way of life. There are children. How can we develop specific approaches in these categories of children aside from communication and psychological approaches? Thank you. Yes, once again, these are global and transversal approaches that will care for a maximum number of people. How do we address this issue? Well, by working with the environment. It can be, for instance, by taking it stage by stage, step by step, slowly, without being too violent or radical, without saying, this is how it's done. No, you take it easy. There are some strategies, and we can go, for example, through women who will talk to women, and as mothers, they will raise the awareness, they will raise each other's awareness. That is, it's like a word of mouth, and women will talk to their husbands, their children. There will be an agreement first in a small group, and then we'll come to know that in the village, there are people who are participating to an activity or a project, so other people may join. You take it step by step in a capillary fashion by every time having a discourse of education. Oftentimes, we identify that when we come with our big shoes and a speech that makes people uncomfortable, they are blocked. When we come to speak with individuals, for instance, journalists, we like to welcome journalists. We're going to talk to this person for 2 hours face to face to explain them our viewpoint, our position. We do education. This person will understand, and perhaps in 1 or 2 months, she may write an article, and this will raise more people's awareness. In the same manner, we can suggest, or we can have groups speaking. We will take some victims or perpetrators or people who have problematic behaviors, and we're going to try little by little to speak to the parents, and we'll see whether there's a block or not. If there's a block, we're going to work with that and then invite people from the community to come. Some people in charge of the community, of course, at the scale of a country, it may begin with the government, that is, start from the Ministry or Apostolate of Education and Child Protection, and at the same time work with teachers, those who work. And at some point, it's going to be grouped. The teacher is going to speak to the school principal, and then to the leader of the region, and then to the education department, perhaps. It's going to trickle down, and little by little, after years of work, we will make things progress. About the deep causes, of course, working on customs can be very violent. If we come to tell them that what you've been doing for centuries doesn't work because it's very violent, no, it's unacceptable. So you have to take it very slowly, starting with empathy, that is trying to place ourselves in the position of the people who do this. That is how the associations worked. You need to try to understand what's at stake. If you start from the principle that these are people who want to hurt children, you make a mistake. No, the children are not going to accept the fact that they hurt their children. On the contrary, they want to protect their children. So we, the professionals, are going to work in our capacity of otherness by putting ourselves in those people's shoes and trying to have a discourse that can be heard, that accompanies change, to try to find spaces where we can hear each other by setting limits, because there are things that are not acceptable based on the law, but there are things that can be discussed and that can be transformed in time, generation to generation. I simply want to ask two questions raised by Beatrice. And from the chat, you're talking about correcting adolescents or children. I think that it is, in fact, important to establish a frame, correct, not in the sense of punishing for the sake of punishing. You don't punish for the sake of punishing. The punishment has to make sense, but it's also about reassuring and about the prevention. I'm going to let Walter speak to that. Okay, why do children do not repeat? Well, because most of them understand that they did something silly. And just as adults, when you've done something silly, sometimes you correct yourself, or you're corrected by the outside, or you correct some behaviors, and you understand that you should not act silly because you'll be punished. But most of them do not repeat their behavior because they're not proud and they want to improve their behavior. To go back to Bene, who spoke about the families, that is complicated. It's always complicated because the children are born in environments they think are normal, and they often find themselves in conflicts of loyalty in very strict family systems. And ultimately, there are values that are shared outside of this closed environment that is in society. Sometimes we have to mistrust an idea that we have if we consider that the culture or the functioning of that family is something cultural. We do this in France as well. There's a region when we think that everybody, that they're all pedophiles in the north. There are families that function very badly. But ultimately, when we pull out children, things are revealed when the children understand that what they're saying is not normal within these families. But it is by being confronted by chance or by need to the the outside environment, then these people will perhaps realize that what they lived on a daily basis was not normal. The fight against sexual abuse against children, we must not think that this is over. What we're doing as far as prevention will perhaps give results in 50 years, in 1 or 2 generations, or perhaps a girl who is prostituted by her father. One day she may run into a friend where she goes to do her activity. She will be confronted to another reality that will make her aware of the fact that what she is experiencing is not normal, whereas she was respecting her family rules that are completely crazy on the outside, but these are her own family norms. And what we're working at is that we have to rely on the political power. We have to develop a will to respect one another. This is the work that will not bring fruits tomorrow, but maybe the day after. This is what's complicated. Oftentimes, we want this to get through many people, but it's difficult. And already the people who are coming out of prostitution because they confronted another situation, they may have behavior that is more adjusted with their own children. Then if we manage that, we'll have achieved a great progress. Thank you so much. There were 2 elements. Rota PC was establishing links with what happens in Uruguay and Latin America about the prevention of sexual abuse. And Brenda was specifying that with COVID-19, the difficulty of giving psychological and psychiatric support because of COVID-19. I don't know whether you want to say a final word about the situation of COVID-19 and the increase of the sexual abuse situation. Real quickly. Obviously, these are things that challenge us very much. I don't know what happens in your countries, but in France, for the past year, we've been confined. Let me remind you that sexual violence is in the front line in many families, and the families have been locked up. But this doesn't make it easy for social workers. A school is working when it works, but school is a place, it's the outside that enters a family, but these are children who are confronted outside and bring things back to their family. So it allows us to identify and to exert some sort of control or verification of family systems that sometimes are very withdrawn. Of course, it's very concerning. And also when it comes to therapeutic groups, that are forbidden because of large numbers, well, things become more complicated. But of course, these issues are very challenging. Sexual violence, spousal violence, the family that is confined and no longer in connection with the society. An interesting action during confinement in France is that we have a telephone number to report children in danger. This number has evolved and it is now connected to an emergency line that usually responded to people who cannot speak, who are dumb, and they could ask for help by message, by text message. So they created a partnership in this state of emergency to allow children and adolescents to send petitions for help by message. So that can be done by text message, WhatsApp, or email. So it's very quickly the child protection adjusted to the situation to continue protecting the people in this situation. I just wanted to raise a few general points. For instance, in the issues of prevention that we're working at in Peru, the only thing that we've achieved is to have harsher judgments, and this led to a situation of greater problem. This is not leading to good results. prevention is a synonym of harsher sentences. So you rape a child and you kill. Sometimes you want to escape this crime. The second point has to do with victims. The victim has been reduced to do justice as revenge. If you send the perpetrator to jail, then the problem is resolved, and you do not think anything beyond that, and that's a problem. It is about the gaze we have on the victims. They are locked up, and we think that the locking up is magical, and depending on the sentence, 8, 10, 15 years, then the number of victims is going to change because the lockup will make him think. There is a current in Latin America that is in juvenile centers, for instance, that about correcting and what is the way to correct it. For instance, there's a problem in young people with crimes of violence in the juvenile centers, that they have a problem with masturbation. There's a problem to be resolved. So how can we resolve the issue of masturbation in juvenile centers? Well, then you have to have them run for 2 hours so that they got over it. There's no psychological intervention, so we're not reaching any solution. I think that we have to look into this therapeutic issue that is very expensive in countries such as Peru, and it requires time. Thank you. It's for the long term, as Walter was saying, it requires many generations. Of course, we have to work at the care of victims, of perpetrators, and professionals who need to be accompanied in their care, and also primary prevention. The primary prevention is education, and this cannot be done overnight. That is to raise the awareness of the people who are responsible. Well, about the issue of masturbation, we know that nowadays masturbation does not raise any issues, but it could be helpful in one's own personal sexual development, of course, if it is something intimate. But this can be worked at the stage of primary prevention. We can speak about this affective relation and sexual education, but there are places where we are far from there. So everything will happen in its time. We cannot be too rushed. It is not a race, a speed race. It's a marathon. It will ask of you, it requires you who are involved into this topic to maintain a good pace and to not exhaust yourselves, because this will take decades, and it will be done little by talking to people who want to know more about it, who are touched by this violence, who experience the sadness of the victims and of the perpetrators, and who see that the way it works today, the way in which it's functioning today, is not helpful. By talking to these people, by being informed, and by continuing being informed and interested into these matters, little by little, more and more people will be aware and will follow you. It is in a cultural moment that may take years. You do not have to let go, and you have to help each other among countries, and which is what the BICE does nowadays. And thank you so much. It is like that. It is by helping each other, sharing knowledge, sharing practices. That is how we may, in the long run, manage to give better care and fight against this violence. The last point is perhaps that in every country that launched this interest into these issues, it was always about the victims. Of course, we started to take this measure. In France, we are 40, 50 years after the first reflections and social awareness of this economic, psychological disaster represented by sexual violence on victims. I mean, it took 40, 50 years to start thinking about this. And I think that we see how important the awareness raising is. And I think that in every country that real work was done, things could progress. Of course, it's not based on the empathy for the perpetrators. We have to go through there. These are stages. And I hear that the issues are very different one country to another. It also depends on the condition of the women, the financial conditions. All of these issues are intertwined, especially in Latin America. We had received the Guatemala delegation that were presenting very different issues. Obviously, it's a matter of awareness raising about the issue of the victims. That is what's going to move things. Thank you. We have to close this meeting. It was very intense. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to the interpreters and the speakers. Dr. Albardier and Mr. Brochot, it's a pleasure to see you. And we will meet again on Thursday, April 22nd for our next session with two speakers. Diana about practice of reparative justice with children entrusted to the law. We have a young person who's going to speak, and Diego about the connection between resilience and reparative justice. So thank you all. Thank you for these debates that make us feel like continuing, but we'll continuing on other points. So see you soon, and thank you very much.